I hope I'm audible. Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Garima Dugar, core member of Doctors for a Cause and a final year medical student. So Doctors for a Cause is up with another masterclass, that is a radiology masterclass. And today is day 3, that is the final day of this masterclass by Dr. Titankar Guha Thakurta, who's an MD Physiology and a teaching faculty at KPC Medical College and Hospital. After the 2 successful masterclasses, that was on neurology and ECG. If you haven't watched it yet, you can always go back and watch it on a YouTube channel. DFC is back with this radiology masterclass, and we hope to get you soon with another series also. For more information on Doctors for a Cause, you can always go back to our socials, and the updates and everything is up on them. Doctors for a Cause is basically a body of medical students, interns, and young doctors based primarily out of Kolkata. We seek to spread awareness, education, and goodwill. So, without any delay, we'll start off with the final day of this masterclass. So, I'll ask you to take over from here.
Thank you, Garima.
Yes, sir.
Hope I'm audible and visible as well.
Yes, sir, you are.
Okay. So let me share with you the plan of today's class, the way we will be holding today's class, because we have already had 2 previous classes. In one of the classes, we discussed the basics of chest X-ray interpretation. In the second one, we discussed how to interpret the CT scan images of brain. So in today's class, what we wish to do is we'll bring them all together in the form of clinical cases. So we can divide today's session into 3 parts. In the first part, we will quickly revise some of the key aspects that we have discussed in the previous 2 classes. This is only to brush our memory. In the second part, we will be dealing with some relatively easier and very easy to recognize clinical cases. And once we become confident with them, we'll move on with more detailed clinical cases with which we end the session. So this is the plan. This will be a totally interactive session. So I would like all of you to participate. In the first 2 parts of the class, I have kept the questions in multiple choice format so that it is easy for you to participate by simply mentioning the letters of the option. But in the third part, it will be a bit descriptive, because MCQs always do not serve the purpose of discussion. So I will guide you through the third part also as to how you can effectively communicate there. So let us start with the first part, that is revision of the previous lessons. So I'll show you a few slides and you have to rapidly quick the correct answer to this. And most of these questions have been already discussed in the previous 2 classes. So just as a reminder, when you look through a chest skygram, you find out the identification and view, the lung fields, heart shadow and mediastinum. Make sure that you trace the borders of the heart, measure the dimensions of the heart, and see the position of the trachea when you are evaluating the mediastinum. Look at the costophrenic and cardiophrenic angles, the position of the diaphragms, the bony cage, the soft tissue shadows, and finally give you radiological or clinical impression. So here we go. Quickly try to diagnose through these diagrams. So what is the diagnosis? Great. It's wonderful to see that all of you are given the right options. Yes, this is an X-ray that shows cardiomegaly. If we go through this, you see one by one, if we explore through the options, this is the maximum cardiac diameter. This is 1/2 of the diameter. This is the other half of the diameter. And together, the sum of these two diameters apparently definitely is more than half of the internal thoracic diameter. So there is cardiomegaly. There is no doubt in that. And pulmonary edema is probably not present here because we do not see hilar congestion or a bat wing like shadow. It is definitely therefore also not a normal cardiac shadow. So we go with the option, it is cardiomegaly. The hilar shadow that you are finding here, these are the normal hilar shadow. They are not exaggerated. In pulmonary edema, they will be highly exaggerated and radiate from here in the form of a bat wing. So that is not seen here. Therefore, this is not pulmonary edema. Okay, moving on to the next case. Identify this. This is actually very easy. Yes, again, all of you have answered correctly. We can see here that there is a reticulonodular pattern, and this is highly corroborative of interstitial disease. So it can be interstitial lung disease, it can be various pulmonary hemorrhage syndromes, it can indicate interstitial pneumonia, or it can also indicate ARDS. But the disease is interstitial and not alveolar in pattern. So the correct option is B, interstitial disease. We move on to the next case. This is a very simple diagnosis. So what is your diagnosis? Again, all of you have answered correctly. This is indeed hydropneumothorax. You can see there is a air fluid level and there is a horizontal fluid level below which there is fluid, above which there is air. And this pattern is highly suggestive of hydropneumothorax. Also, to support this, there is a shift of the trachea to the opposite side. So mediastinal shifting is also there due to the pressure effect. And this is very much suggestive of hydropneumothorax. Wonderful. We move on to the next case. What is your diagnosis? So all of you are writing none. So what diagnosis will you write on the X-ray report? If you are the radiologist, what will be your final impression? No, you cannot write female subject as your diagnosis. The diagnosis will be a normal chest X-ray. So the diagnosis is normal chest X-ray. Very good. Then we move on to the fifth one. What is this? Yes, again, all of you have answered correctly. These are multiple round space occupying lesions looking like cannonball metastasis. And this is how pulmonary metastasis looks like. So this is metastatic disease of the lung. So I'm glad that you could at a glance recognize this. These are not only the common varieties of X-rays that we see, these are also very important for your final MBBS examination. These are the very common varieties of X-ray that we usually present to you during the examination, and you should be immediately able to look at it and diagnose it. Very good. So now we move on to the revision of our CT scan slices. We know that CT scan is interpreted in 5 steps, and it's remembered by this funny mnemonic, blood can be very bad. Of course, it is very bad when it is in the wrong place or in the wrong time. And so the mnemonic stands for blood, and you look for different types of hemorrhage. The cistern, where you look for the presence of blood. The brain, you look for gray-white differentiation, effacement, shift, hyper or hypodense lesions and tumor. Ventricles look for hemorrhage and hydrocephalus. And in the bone, particularly if there is a bone window, you look for fractures. So these are the steps through which a CT scan is essentially interpreted. So let's go very quickly through the old slides that we have already seen. So name the structure that you identify here. So those who are writing D, none of the above, can you name the structure? What is that structure? Oh, D is Sylvian, I'm sorry. E is none of the above. Yes, this is the Sylvian cistern. So all of you have given the right option. This is D, Sylvian cistern, also known as the cistern at the insular lobe. So this is a very important cistern which can become prominent or hyperdense in case of subarachnoid hemorrhage. So this is the Sylvian cistern. Very good. We move on to the next one. What is the structure labeled here? Wonderful. So all of you have correctly answered. This is the thalamus. We know that this complex includes the caudate nucleus above, the thalamus below. The internal capsule runs in a curved way in between, and lateral to the internal capsule lies the lenticular nucleus consisting of putamen and globus pallidus. So we have the basal ganglia thalamus complex here. Okay, so the next question. So yes, all of you have given the right options. This is calcified choroid plexus. Choroid plexus is often calcified, and it is not pineal gland because pineal gland is a midline structure. It is not peripheral. And it is lateral ventricle, but that is not a bright structure. That is the dark structure. And it is possibly not an artery because no artery runs through the ventricle. So the answer is choroid plexus. Identify this one. Yes, very good. So this is epidural hematoma, or also known as extradural hematoma. It is because of this lens-like shape or spindle shape that we can identify that this is extradural or epidural hemorrhage. We move on to the fifth one. So here again, most of you have answered correctly. Many of you jumped to the conclusion that it is B. Of course, it's B, but it's actually all of the above. So if you see this area that we see here is definitely a subdural hematoma because of this crescentic shape. Because of this variegated appearance of hypo and hyperdense lesions together, it is a chronic subdural hematoma. There's no doubt about that. But you also see that there has been a midline shift. Quite evidently, there has been a midline shift. The ventricles are no longer present symmetrically, and therefore there has been a midline shift. And also you see that the sulci and the gyri are not at all very prominent, as if they have been compressed all over. The distinction between sulci gyri are almost obscured, indicating there is a probably raised intracranial tension because of this pressure effect or the mass effect. So the answer is D, all of the above. So that was a good revision, and I'm glad that all of you wonderfully assimilated all that we discussed in our previous classes. So based on this, we are now going to discuss today's new lessons, and today we are only going to synthesize the old days lessons into clinical cases. So initially I'll give you a few clinical cases that are brief, to the point, and easy to understand. So let us try to solve them one by one. So here comes your first case. A 65-year-old man presented with acute onset breathlessness. The chest X-ray showed this. What is your diagnosis? The complaint of the patient is breathlessness. So we are getting an array of answers. Most of the answers that you are presenting are between A and C. Some think that it can be B also. Before we go directly into the answer, let us try to understand the question. So when we speak of pulmonary edema of any sort, we mean that there is some extra fluid, abnormally excess fluid in the lung. Pulmonary edema can be of two types. Fluid can accumulate in the alveoli, and that is pulmonary alveolar edema. Fluid can accumulate in the interstitial space, that is pulmonary interstitial edema. And together they constitute pulmonary edema. Now, pulmonary edema, based on the mechanism, can also be of two types. When the pulmonary edema is secondary to congestion of blood due to heart failure, it is called cardiogenic pulmonary edema. And this is typically seen in left ventricular failure or congestive cardiac failure of the left side. And when the mechanism is an injury and inflammation of the lung, then it is known as non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema. And the typical cause is acute respiratory distress syndrome or acute lung injury. Now, looking at the patterns of these edema, if you want to find out how they actually look like, then diagrammatically, if I represent them, see, suppose this is a schematic representation of the lung fields with the heart shadows. Now the vessels at the hilum radiate like this. So when there is heart failure, fluid starts to get congested in the pulmonary vessels. So the pulmonary vessels first become prominent. And then, because fluid has a tendency to accumulate from below upward, particularly when there is stasis. So at first the lower lobe vessels become prominent. And then as the disease becomes more and more severe, then in the extreme case, the upper lobe vessels also become prominent. This prominence of the upper lobe vessel is always a late sign, and because of gravity only. And you can see that it looks like the uh, horn of an antler or a deer. Therefore, it is also sometimes known as the staghorn antlered sign. Sometimes, very funnily, it is called the inverted mustache sign, because it looks like an inverted mustache. And that is always the end stage of the pulmonary edema. And together, when you consider the lower congestion, the middle congestion, and the upper congestion, everything together, in an outline, this looks like as if this is a bat that has spread its wing. So together, it is also sometimes known as a bat wing shadow. This pattern is very typical of cardiogenic pulmonary edema because it starts in the vessel and the fluid starts developing in layers from below upwards. Whereas if in a different case, suppose there is some sort of direct injury to the lung, suppose a toxic gas has been inhaled or an invasive bacteria has infected the lung, then the injury will be present everywhere. It will not discriminate between upper lobe, middle lobe, and lower lobe. So throughout the lung, we will see that there are features of congestion. And the whole lung has a ground glass-like appearance or a reticulonodular appearance because of the interstitial pattern. So fluid starts accumulating in the interstitium and the whole lung gets involved, and you get a granular reticulated appearance. Of course, it doesn't look like lines. I'm only showing that the whole lung is involved. So the whole lung becomes involved with a reticulated appearance. And this is the appearance you get in non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema or in ARDS. Now, keeping this in mind, if we get back to the case that we were discussing, now here you can easily find out if I want to match the pattern, which is matching this. In the upper part, there is more black area. In the lower part, there is more white area. So it is quite obvious that in the lower part, the congestion is more and in the upper part, it is less. So it is not a homogeneous ground glass-like opacity. Also, if you look very carefully, these are not formed of dotted reticulated pattern, but these are like lines radiating from the hilum. And these radiations become thicker and denser at the bottom because the vessels become more congested with blood at the bottom because of gravity. This goes more with the pattern that we see in the batwing shadow of cardiogenic pulmonary edema. So here we will go for the diagnosis of C, heart failure, more specifically left ventricular failure. Is this clear to everyone? Deepayan, you were asking what are Carley's B line. Carley's B line are the lines that you are finding here. These indicate septal edema. So when the alveolar septa become edematous, this fluid produces horizontal lines, and these are often known as the Carley's B lines. They also form the periphery of the wing of the bat. And yes, there is a bit of cardiomegaly also, Mayuk, because maybe this person has a pre-existing heart disease. We do not know. The heart failure must have happened due to some cause. So this is how I'm actually glad that you are noticing so many findings in a single picture. This is how we synthesize all findings together and corroborate clinically to come to a clinical diagnosis. So moving on to the next case. Read this. So all of you are of the opinion that is pneumothorax, and actually this is true. This is a case of pneumothorax. You can easily see that on the right side there is a dark black lung field, indicating that it is becoming radiolucent. And you can also see the margin of the collapsed lung here. There has been a gross mediastinal shifting as indicated by shifting of the tracheal shadow and shifting of the heart on the opposite side. So this is pneumothorax. Tuberculosis is a very common cause of non-traumatic pneumothorax, because in tuberculosis we see that patients often have spontaneous rupture of the pleura from inside or outside, and it often leads to formation of a connection with the bronchus, a bronchopleural fistula, and this causes air to go into. So when air can go in and out freely, it is called an open pneumothorax. When air goes in and then it is sealed by a clot, it is called a closed pneumothorax. And when air only enters but cannot exit and continuously grows in size, it is called a tension pneumothorax or valvular pneumothorax. That cannot be diagnosed from a single X-ray. That is more a clinical opinion, or you can find that out with sequential X-ray images. So here all that we can comment here is that there is a right-sided pneumothorax. So moving on to the next question, read this. A 45-year-old diabetic patient presented with chronic fatigue and weight loss, and this is the chest X-ray finding. So what might be the cause? So we have all the possible answers from A to D. So let us try to understand this. The pattern that you are getting here is a nodular reticular pattern or a mottled pattern. Now, technically, this can be ARDS. It can also be miliary tuberculosis. But that is why I said it's a clinical case. You have to corroborate clinically. ARDS will develop within hours to days, but this patient has symptoms which are chronic in nature. There is a chronic fatigue and weight loss that cannot happen in one day. So this is definitely a chronic case that we are dealing with. So the features go more preferably to tuberculosis. Metastasis does not look like this. So this is probably not metastasis. This kind of picture may have many other differential diagnoses also. So if we want to discuss the differential diagnosis of this kind of a reticulated pattern or mottled pattern, then the possibilities that we have are, in India, you always think of tuberculosis first if it's a chronic disease. So it can be miliary tuberculosis. If the presentation is very acute, it can be ARDS or acute lung injury. If there is severe cough, allergic symptom, history of helminthiasis, it can also represent some sort of a hypereosinophilic syndrome. And it can be some rare type of pneumonia like the interstitial pneumonia, the atypical pneumonias that are caused by atypical organisms. Or it can be very rare types of interstitial lung diseases also. But now looking at the options that are given in this question, options included tuberculosis, options included ARDS, option included pneumonia. Now pneumonia, unless otherwise specified, is always taken to be lobar or bronchopneumonia. Atypical pneumonia has to be separately mentioned. Also, ILD and hypereosinophilic syndrome were not given in the options. So you are left with ARDS and miliary TB. And now clinically, as the patient has a chronic history of fatigue and weight loss, it is more likely to be a case of TB than ARDS, which should have happened within hours. So I think we are good with this. So here probably we will go for the best option as tuberculosis. Yes, Loeffler syndrome is one form of pulmonary eosinophilia. Hypereosinophilic syndromes are also a group of disorders that can happen secondary to ascariasis, which is Loeffler syndrome. It can happen secondary to occult filariasis, and sometimes it can happen as part of different allergic or autoimmune or even chronic myelogenous processes. So all these together are hypereosinophilic syndromes, which can lead to pulmonary eosinophilias. Moving on to the next question. Try this. In the previous question, yes, Sri Rupa is asking, why is diabetes mentioned? Diabetes or immunosuppression are the commonest risk factors of tuberculosis. So diabetes indirectly is telling you that you are dealing with tuberculosis. So a 42-year-old female presented with recurrent breathlessness and palpable liver margin. Chest X-ray showed this. What is your diagnosis? So we have a lot of options here. Many of you are going for B, C, and D. Again, let us analyze the case and let's see which one might be correct. So when you get a picture where the lung fields are hyperlucent, that is very dark black in color, there are two options that should come to your mind. One is pneumothorax. The other is emphysema. Remember, collapse causes radiodense appearance. That is, it makes the affected lung field white because it is, remember in this way, what does collapse mean? The air from the lung has gone away. Now, air is black, tissue is white. So if air goes away, automatically the tissue condenses and it becomes white in color. So collapse is never black in color. Collapse is always radio opaque. It is always white in color. So it is not collapse, first of all. So now coming over to pneumothorax and emphysema. Emphysema is always bilateral because it's a systemic process. Pneumothorax may be unilateral and may be bilateral. In case of unilateral pneumothorax, there will be mediastinal shift. In case of equal pneumothorax on both sides, there may not be any mediastinal shift. But pneumothorax is almost always an acute process that causes a sudden onset breathlessness. And this will also cause hemodynamic collapse if it is bilateral, and the patient will not survive for a long time at home. On the other hand, emphysema is a chronic process, and the patient will live for a long time. That is where the history comes in handy, whether it was a gradual recurrent breathlessness or it was an acute breathlessness with hemodynamic collapse of the patient. What are we actually dealing with? When emphysema occurs, the base of the lung descends downward because of inflation. And so the diaphragm also goes down. As the diaphragm goes down, automatically it pushes all the viscera downwards. So on the right side, the liver goes downward. On the left side, the spleen goes downward. And because they go downward, they may be palpable under the costal margin. This is not true organomegaly. This is basically a descent of the viscera. So if you percuss, the span of the organ will remain same, only the organ becomes palpable. So this is often called viscerotosis, simply meaning falling down of the viscera. So we are experiencing here flattening of the diaphragm with viscerotosis. There is hyperinflation of both lungs, and this is probably not pneumothorax because A, the collapsed margin of lung is not visible in any one of them. It is also not acute in presentation, and since it's recurrent, that means patient must have had this before and survived at home. It cannot be bilateral pneumothorax with which a patient has survived this long. So we land up to the diagnosis of COPD. COPD includes emphysema and chronic bronchitis. So this is COPD because there are hyperlucent lung fields. You can see the bronchovascular markings are seen, which means the lung has not collapsed. Also, it means the lung margin is not visible because vessels are all spread out. It also shows flattening of the diaphragm. And this is the reason probably why the liver has become palpable. The liver is not pathological in this case. So is it clear why we end up in COPD, that is particularly emphysema in this case? If this is clear, I'll move on to the next case. Great. So now try to solve this. A 65-year-old man presented with heaviness over chest and breathlessness, and this is the chest X-ray finding. So all of you are going for option D, and it's correctly option D. You can clearly see the meniscus sign being positive here. So there are menisci on both sides that are directed inwards with radio opacity below and clear lung fields above. So yes, this is bilateral pleural effusion. Because it is bilateral, so there has been no mediastinal shifting, because the pushing and the pulling forces have acted from both sides, and therefore it has been neutralized. We move on to the next case. See this. This is actually very easy. 43-year-old man presented with sudden onset severe headache. So what is your diagnosis here? Okay, so almost all of you are going with the option B, that is subarachnoid hemorrhage. Let us see if this is correct. We can find here that the star-shaped cistern, the suprasellar cistern, is filled with radiodense material, which is almost always blood unless otherwise specified. We also find that the insular or the sylvian cistern are also filled with blood. The ambient cistern around the midbrain is also filled with blood. So since all the cisterns are filled with blood and the cisterns are connected to subarachnoid space, this indicates subarachnoid hemorrhage. So this is subarachnoid hemorrhage. You know, another way it can present is if you look at the surface of the brain, the sulci will be filled with blood. That is another way to understand that is subarachnoid hemorrhage. So I hope this is clear. So we move on to the next case. See this. A 35-year-old lady presented with a sudden onset weakness. The CT brain shows you this. So what will be your diagnosis? So most of you think it is A and some also think it's C. Let's see which one is correct. This whole area here has become hypodense and definitely indicates infarction. So this is an ischemic stroke, no doubt. And this white area here is not hemorrhage. You already know these represent the choroid plexus. This possibly might be the pineal gland. So any other white structure here is either bone or pineal or choroid. So they are not hemorrhage. This is purely a case of ischemic stroke. And do not be confused with these white specks here. This is not hemorrhagic stroke. So this is ischemic stroke. I hope this is clear. I have a question to ask you. What is evident here is that in this ischemic stroke also there has been a midline shift. Quite visibly, there has been a midline shift. This is how the midline has shifted. My question is, in ischemia, blood is not accumulating. Actually, blood is not going to the brain. So volume is not increasing. So what is pushing the brain on the opposite side? Yes, very good. So it is the inflammatory edema. It is because of the cellular injury that there is edema of the cell and also the tissue, and it is this edema that pushes the brain to the opposite side. This is the edema also which partly imparts the black color here, because water takes black color in the CT images. Wonderful. So we move on to the next slide. Solve this. So it is a more detailed description. See which description matches the case. So all of you think that the correct option is B, while some think that it can be D, all of the above. Let's see. Here is a speck of hemorrhage that is definitely affecting the right internal capsule. So B is correct, but whether A and C are also correct is the question. This black area that you see here is not stroke. It's basically prominence of the sulci. We are dealing with a 72-year-old hypertensive male. So cortical atrophy is very common at 72 years of age. Sulci gyri often become very prominent. This is the importance of the history, that the patient is 72-year-old. And we have already discussed these are not hemorrhage. These represent the choroid plexus. So we are dealing here only with hemorrhagic stroke around the internal capsule. So if it is affecting the right side of the brain, so possibly now the patient will have complete hemiplegia of the left side. We move on to the next case. So a 68-year-old hypertensive female presented with sudden onset unconsciousness and pinpoint pupil. So CT brain shows which of these? So we are now split between B and C. There was a rush of answers involving B, and now there is a rush of answers involving C. Those who think it is B, can you write in one line why it is B? And those who are writing C, can you write in one line why it is C? Okay, so pontine hemorrhage leads to pinpoint pupil. No quadrigeminal cistern is seen. Pinpoint pupil, also fourth ventricle is seen. Okay, so coming here to this answer, I will go clinically with pinpoint pupil indicating a pontine hemorrhage, of course. But you also see radiologically, when you see the suprasellar cistern, it means that you are dealing with the midbrain. So it is quite possible that in this patient, there is a large hemorrhage that has affected part of the midbrain and almost all of the pons, particularly the third nerve nucleus. So that is a possibility. And of course, with one section, this is difficult to say. So going clinically, my diagnosis will be that we are dealing with a pontine stroke, and this image supports the finding that the stroke is not only located to pons but has also spread to the midbrain. So only radiologically speaking, this is a midbrain hemorrhage. But speaking both clinically and radiologically, there is definitely pontine hemorrhage. And because brainstem is such a small structure, it's quite obvious that if there is such a big hemorrhage in the midbrain, pontine hemorrhage is quite possible. So here, had there been an option of B plus C, that would have been the right option. So in that sense, those who have said B are clinically correct. Those who have said C are radiologically correct. And the final diagnosis is actually a combination of the two. There is hemorrhage involving both pons and the midbrain. Am I clear to this? So actually, these options are not the best options to choose from. Solve this. So look at this image. You have been seeing CT images so long. In what way do you think it differs from the CT scan image? So an MRI image, all of you are saying D. It gives you better resolution. You can see the sulci gyri more accurately. Clear longitudinal section. That is a problem we encounter with CT scans. CT scan often fails to give good longitudinal section. It's good only at transverse sections. Better imaging of brain, spine, and joints. And therefore, all these are the advantages of MRI scan over CT scan. The disadvantage being technique, time, and of course the expenses. So from here we quickly discuss the principle of the MRI imaging, which many of you asked me specifically to discuss today. So how does magnetic resonance occur, and how is physically the MRI image created? I will not discuss in great detail because that's beyond the scope of today's webinar, but I'll try to discuss in a conceptual briefing how the MRI machine works and what is the physics behind that. So what MRI machine does, what magnetic resonance imaging utilizes, is the magnetic spin of the protons in our body. Now our body is a protonated solution, so there is no dearth of proton. So there are water molecules and H plus ions or hydrogen atoms everywhere. And wherever we find the protons, we find many of them have a particular spin. Now, we know that when there is an object which is charged and is also spinning around an axis, it will also simultaneously generate a magnetic field around it. So if it spins in a particular axis, there will also be a corresponding magnetic field generated. Say B. So all hydrogen atoms in our body, in that sense, are mini magnets, atomic magnets. At the resting condition where there is no external magnetic field, because Earth's magnetic field is negligible. So when there is no external magnetic field acting on our body, they are chaotically or thermodynamically arranged so that the net magnetic field is almost zero. So they are oriented in different directions. So what is the principle on which MRI work? If you split the word MRI, you get the following components. One component is the magnetic. The second component is resonance. And the third component is imaging. So how do we, using the magnetic property of the H plus ion and using the principle of resonance of waves, create an image? When an external electromagnetic field is applied on the body, the otherwise chaotically arranged H plus ions or the hydrogen atoms, their spin will be arranged in a particular direction. So previously they were chaotically arranged. So previously, suppose the H plus were arranged in this manner, all moving around a different axis. Now when an external strong magnetic field is applied, then they start orienting according to the magnetic field. So now you see that these hydrogen atoms will start orienting in a particular direction. Whatever be the direction, but they will be now oriented. But that is definitely not their neutral position. They were already in their neutral position before. So this orientation is something like that there is a pendulum which is reverberating on its own. You are forcibly pulling it at one side. Now, after orienting them like magnets, which are now at equilibrium with the magnetic field, you apply a small radio frequency wave to this whole setup. From any particular direction, suppose from this direction only. Whenever an energy is provided to a dipole, it will start swinging. It will convert into the energy of its moment. So it also starts swinging. Based on the principle of resonance, if the frequency of the incident force is exactly equal to the natural frequency of the particle, then it will reach the maximum amplitude. And this is exactly where resonance comes into play. This is where we apply the principle of resonance. We calculate and apply a specific frequency which matches with the frequency of the magnet, that is the hydrogen atom that we are dealing with. So it will now start oscillating it or bouncing it at maximum amplitude. Then what we do is, then we suddenly stop the frequency. So the pulse which was given is abruptly cut off. Now imagine what is happening. I'm discussing once again. Hydrogen atoms were randomly oriented. Now you give a magnetic field, they're oriented in one direction. Then from outside, you give a radio frequency pulse. The pulse matches the frequency, natural frequency of the atoms or the magnet. So they start bouncing with maximum amplitude. Then you stop the pulse. Now when you stop the pulse, what is happening? These charged magnets are still bouncing. And as they are bouncing, a moving charged particle generates its own radio frequency. So now back from this, radio frequency waves are generated, which are the particle's own radio frequency waves. These are created by the residual pulsation of the micromagnets. After the force has been suddenly stopped, they are still oscillating until the whole energy is pent up, and that is releasing the energy in quantums of radio frequency that can be collected from different directions. Now imagine that your whole body is composed of multiple small hydrogen atoms. Each of them can be considered to be a position coordinate. So when from the x-axis you give a pulse and it gives you back an x-axis frequency, you get all of their position along the x-axis. They do not reach the receiver at the same time, so that also helps you calculate their relative distances. You give another pulse from the y-axis, you get their y coordinates. You give another pulse from the z-axis, you get their z coordinates. So all hydrogen atoms in your body, therefore, have a specific x, y, z coordinate. And the machine synthesizes this data and does something that in the language of algebra we call Fourier analysis. So it converts this into a 3D image and you get the 3D image of the body. So this is how, by an external magnetic field, you orient the hydrogen atom, you generate an artificial radio frequency pulse, and you force the magnets into resonance. Then you stop the pulse. Then until they come into the equilibrium position or until they rest, they themselves start radiating the energy in the form of radio frequency pulse, which is accepted from different axes, and a 3D image is reconstructed. This is how MRI works without using any ionizing radiation, but it is a time consuming and expensive process. I hope this is clear to all of you. Is the very basic principle of MRI clear? Why it is magnetic, why it is resonance, and how it is imaging. Okay, wonderful. So let us get back to what we were discussing. Yes, in contrast MRI that you are asking, as a contrast medium, we use another atom having a different kind of radio frequency. So with a desirable kind of radio frequency that we are using, sometimes the contrast will become prominent and sometimes the baseline tissue becomes prominent. Also, there are many other weighting techniques of MRI. There are many other signaling techniques that is beyond the scope of today's discussion. I only briefly discussed about the mechanism. If you are interested, I can send you articles, and they're very easy to understand also and very interesting at the same time. So this is essentially what is magnetic resonance imaging. We move on to the final cases now, and this will require your active participation. So I will be asking you questions, and you are requested to write down the answers very briefly in the chat box. So a 65-year-old man presented with hallucinations. 65-year-old man presented with hallucinations. What are your differential diagnosis? Just give me a list of your differential diagnosis. What are the possibilities? So I'm only noting down all that you are saying. So most of you are saying schizophrenia. One is saying alcohol abstinence. Yes, that is also possible. What else are possible? It can be schizophrenia, which is itself a psychosis, intoxication. Yes, dementia. Dementia often presents with features of hallucinations. It can be drug use. OCD typically does not cause hallucination. It can be electrolyte imbalance, yes. Although it will cause more commonly delirium, that can be misinterpreted as hallucination. Oishani wrote epilepsy. Yes, temporal lobe epilepsy particularly can cause hallucination. Drug use like marijuana use, PTSD can also, PTSD doesn't cause hallucinations though. Lewy body dementia is an important cause. So is dementia of Parkinson's disease. So with this in mind, that these are the possibilities, let us suppose that two different patients having the same symptom had two different imagings. So I'm showing you the image of the first patient. Make your diagnosis. The clinical complaint is same. A 65-year-old man presented with hallucination. So what is your diagnosis here? So we can see there is a space occupying lesion in the temporal lobe, probably a tumor, but can also be a calcified hemorrhage. So a space occupying lesion in temporal lobe, and that also explains why there are hallucinations, because temporal lobe lesions can also cause visual and auditory symptoms. As a different case, suppose the patient would have had a different kind of X-ray, CT scan. I'm showing you another CT scan in a different patient having the same problem, patient presenting with hallucination. Then how will you change your diagnosis? If this would have been the picture in a different patient with the same symptom, how will you change your diagnosis? What is the diagnosis here in the CT scan? So all we can see here is there is good white matter, dark matter differentiation. We also see that there is a normal calcification of the choroid, and also not much atrophy is seen, but the sulci are seen in many places. So it is also not raised intracranial tension. There is no dark coloration of the whole brain. We can still identify the basal ganglia complex and internal capsule. So it is not edema also. That means the cause will be a non-organic brain syndrome. It's difficult to say what it is, but it will be something non-organic. That means we are either dealing with schizophrenia, other forms of psychosis, a temporal lobe epilepsy, or something like that. This is a new case. So suppose a 30-year-old man presented with pedal and abdominal swelling. His chest X-ray showed this. So first look at the chest X-ray. You can easily see the pathology here. And what are the differential diagnoses? No, whatever DD you give me, you have to explain all the symptoms. That is, the same diagnosis will explain the pedal and abdominal swelling and will also explain the swelling in the chest. I'm not asking for separate diagnosis for separate symptom. Those who are writing tumor or metastasis, can you explain why the tumor or metastasis will cause pedal swelling and abdominal swelling? Why will it cause pedal swelling? And those who are saying it is a right ventricular failure, explain why right ventricular failure will cause this mass. Yes, now I'm getting some answers. It may be a tumor that has metastasized to a point where the inferior vena cava is compressed, causing pedal and abdominal swelling. And the same tumor has metastasized to the lung that has caused a cannonball shadow. That is one possibility. So that is a good possibility. Regarding paraneoplastic syndrome, it may be a bronchogenic carcinoma, which by paraneoplastic syndrome is causing increased secretion of certain hormones like renin or ADH that can also cause fluid accumulation. That is also possible. It can also be a malignant ascites, which is causing abdominal swelling, and compression of IVC that is causing the pedal edema. This is not hydatid cyst because it doesn't look like that. It can be a primary liver tumor metastasizing to the lung. Of course, it can be. And the liver tumor is the cause of the abdominal swelling. And its metastasis in and around the leg vessels, like the common iliac vessels or the inferior vena cava, can explain pedal swelling. What else can it be? So now thinking of the possibilities, if in follow-up, this was your finding, then what will be your diagnosis? What will be your diagnosis of the shadow if it disappears after 7 days of diuretic therapy or furosemide therapy? Out of so many differential diagnoses. Now, if you say heart failure, then you also have to give me diagnosis of the shadow. Of course, heart failure will go away with diuretic therapy. So pedal swelling and abdominal swelling goes away. What was this swelling to start with then? You cannot give me two diagnoses together. You have to give me one diagnosis. Then heart failure should explain why this shadow was there. The idea of a differential diagnosis is to develop one diagnosis that explains everything. We can always find multiple diagnoses for multiple causes. Pulmonary embolus doesn't show like this because embolism causes infarction, and you know infarction will typically be black in color, not white. Those who are saying small cell carcinoma, why will the carcinoma go away by 7 days of furosemide therapy? Can any carcinoma disappear with diuretic therapy? No anti-cancer therapy was given. So only with diuretic therapy, how can the tumor go away? Yes, very good. This is the edema in the fissure of the lung. So this is typically, so that means there is a right heart failure and water has accumulated in the fissure between the upper and the lower lobe, or the middle and the lower lobe. And this often appears falsely as a tumor. This is a special kind of pleural effusion that has happened in between the fissures where pleural reflections are present. And such loculated collections are sometimes known as phantom tumor, because these are tumors which look like tumors but disappear with diuretics. So phantom tumors are typically edema in between the fissure of the lung that in the X-ray look like a tumor. It can be easily distinguished by 3 or 4 days of diuretic therapy. So I hope the concept of phantom tumor is clear to you. On the other hand, if the case would have been like this, What would be your next plan as a doctor if the mass remains after 7 days of furosemide therapy? Suppose you gave furosemide for 7 days, but there was no change in the mass. What will be the next investigation that you will do? Yes, very good. You will either do a CT guided biopsy or you will do an FNAC of the lesion to find out the type of the mass. Wonderful. So you understand this is the role of radiology. It can guide you in the therapy. It can guide you to understand the clinical prognosis and also in some cases the clinical diagnosis. We move on to the next case. See this. So a 12-year-old child presented with breathlessness. His chest X-ray showed this. Look at the X-ray and give me a list of causes that can present like this. What is very apparent here? It's not a difficult thing. So you look and say, what are the possibilities? Yes, so there is obvious cardiomegaly, and therefore it can also be pericardial effusion given the shape of the cardiomegaly. It looks like a bag. So it can be pericardial effusion and cardiomegaly. Wonderful. So all causes of cardiomegaly, all causes of pericardial effusion will become your differential diagnosis. Now suppose you can see that this X-ray is hazy, and in many rural setups or in setups where digital X-ray is not available, we often get X-ray films like this. So you suppose ask the patient to repeat the X-ray. You ask the patient to repeat the X-ray by a digital method. So a digital X-ray gives you a clearer image. I'll show you a clearer image. Now tell me if you would like to change your diagnosis. This is a digital X-ray. So if you want to stick to the same diagnosis, you can write cardiomegaly or pleural effusion. Or if you have something extra to add, you can also add. Is there something atypical that you see here? Something, even if you cannot diagnose, it doesn't matter. Is there something that stands out? Yes. We can see that there are gas shadows, bubbles of air. So there is something that has gone inside in the form of air. It can be a pneumopericardium, it can be pneumomediastinum, or it can be diaphragmatic hernia, as some of you have told. So something with gas in it has entered the chest. So probably that shadow is overlapping with the heart shadow and is giving you the impression of a bigger heart. So if you want to find out whether the shadow is due to heart or due to the hernia of the esophagus and stomach, what is the simplest test you can do using X-ray? Not using CT scan or invasive procedure. You only have the X-ray machine with you. So what else would you like to do? Yes, we can do a lateral view. We can also do a barium swallow come barium meal. Barium swallow demonstrates the esophagus and meal demonstrates the stomach. So obviously the doctors then advised a barium study, a barium swallow come meal, and this is the picture. So now I think the picture is very clear. This apparent enlargement was largely due to the pressure effect that was caused by the diaphragmatic hernia. So this diaphragmatic hernia also pushed the heart behind. And when you push the heart behind in a PA view, it behaves like an AP view because heart becomes close to the X-ray and you get a magnified view of the heart. And that overlaps with the shadow of the hernia, giving you a more complicated picture. So this is how we can simply differentiate whether it is due to an overlapping shadow of the hernia or due to the heart. Is this clear to everyone? Okay. So we move on to our next case. Read the case carefully. Mr. X, who is 56 years old, was brought to the outpatient department by his son, saying that he is behaving strangely since the last 6 months. Mr. X had no complaints. His son said that Mr. X did not sleep well, got up at the middle of the night and started shouting without provocation. And his behavior was turning obscene day by day. So what is your differential diagnosis? What are the possibilities? So Ashani, you are saying it can be delirium. It can be, but delirium is often an acute condition. It will not last for 6 months. If someone is saying it can be a frontal lobe tumor, which is a wonderful saying, because frontal lobe tumor typically causes judgment difficulty and social inappropriate behavior. Those who are saying psychosis and schizophrenia, that's also possible. There can be a disorganized schizophrenia, which can lead to behavioral changes. Narcolepsy is probably not the diagnosis. Narcolepsy does not present like this. It presents more with cataplexy, presents with hypersomnolence or sleep attacks. It presents with patients having automatism during the narcoleptic episode. That is not exactly what we are finding here. Bipolarity is a possibility. Maybe that this is the manic phase of the bipolar disorder. That is also possible, quite possible. It can be a REM sleep behavioral disorder also. Yes, that is also quite possible. So it can be a kind of a somnopathy or a sleep disorder. So of course here what we can think of is a detailed psychiatric evaluation to rule out the organic delirium causes that you said, which are more common in elderly. You definitely rule out electrolyte imbalances. You rule out the possibilities of organic pathology by finding out hypoglycemic attacks, the thyroid function test, renal function test. So if all these come out to be good enough and the psychiatric history does not reveal something, we are left with organic brain damage. So let us see what the finding is. It can be a tumor, it can be any other finding in the frontal lobe. So let's see what this is. So the doctors did all this, and this is the finding that they landed up into. So the complete hemogram, TSH, sodium, potassium, creatinine, the causes of delirium are ruled out. Blood sugar was normal. And this is the MRI of the brain, which is same as the CT scan image as well, with a better resolution. So what do you think are the new DDs for the case? What are the new differential diagnoses? There is cerebral atrophy. So what is the clinical diagnosis? In which case do you get atrophies like this? Senile atrophy is never this severe. So the options that you have here are different neurodegenerative conditions, and this pattern of atrophy is often common in either Alzheimer's or in frontotemporal dementia. With this limited history, it's difficult to say what this is. But if you look at the MRI image, you must be able to see that the atrophy is strictly limited to the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. The frontal lobe has been affected. Temporal lobe has also been affected. Occipital lobe is more or less preserved. It's not that much atrophic. Also, if you go by the clinical history of the patient, the age is 56. This is the age for frontotemporal dementia, the 50s, or the age of the early onset Alzheimer. Now, here the radiological picture is more like frontotemporal, where frontal and temporal lobes are mostly damaged. Age also matches frontotemporal. And frontotemporal typically starts with behavioral dysfunction and socially inappropriate behavior. So probably we are dealing here with a frontotemporal dementia. We must keep other causes of dementia as a differential diagnosis. And they can only be differentiated clinically, not by radiological investigation. Is this clear? So if this is clear to all of you, I'll move on. Yes, Peak's disease is the commonest subtype of frontotemporal dementia. So we move on to the last case of today. It's a 5-part case. Frontotemporal dementia, Vishal, there is no good treatment. Just in the way COPD is treated by borrowing the drugs from asthma, similarly, frontotemporal dementia is treated by borrowing the drugs from Alzheimer. And of course, it doesn't give good result. So it's a progressive disorder with a not very good prognosis. So we start with case 15. A 13-year-old boy was brought to the psychiatry OPD with paranoid delusions and visual hallucinations. Physical examination was normal except pallor and mild icterus. His knee jerk was slightly exaggerated and he was given haloperidol tablet for the delusions and hallucinations. What are the differential diagnoses? Give me the list of DDs. So one is Wilson disease with hepatic encephalopathy. Second, with this information, you cannot just have only one diagnosis. What I'm trying to say is it's not about the correct or wrong diagnosis. You can land up in Wilson finally. But what are the possibilities when you think like this? This is not hepatic encephalopathy, by the way, because patient is not unconscious. Yes, this can be the pre-coma stage of hepatic encephalopathy. Yes, it is also important to know if the patient was medicated before. If the patient was given antipsychotic drugs before, that could have caused the rigidity and exaggerated knee reflexes. We move on to the next thing. So he was responding moderately to haloperidol. After 1 month, he presented with severe bradykinesia and raised muscle tone. So the hallucinations remained and the icterus and knee reflex was further exaggerated. So what is the diagnosis now? Now it seems more likely to be a case of Wilson disease because it can be Wilson. It can also be other forms of genetically transmitted neuropathies, but then that is not likely to cause icterus. Also, haloperidol is not toxic enough to increase the icterus. So that is where actually you start thinking of Wilson. It can be a Parkinson plus syndrome, therefore. So Parkinson-like feature with a hepatitis-like feature together definitely means now that we are dealing with a Wilson. So if you do an MRI scan of brain, what do you expect? Or in a CT scan of brain, what do you expect to see in Wilson disease? What will be your expected findings on the MRI scan? Basal ganglia damage. What kind of damage? Will you get, in the language of CT scan, hyperdense lesion or hypodense lesion? Or in the language of MRI, high intensity signal or low intensity signal? You'll be getting hyperdense signal, which can be falsely called calcification, but it can also be copper deposition. We really do not know. So there will be hyperdense lesions or high intensity signals. Let's see what is the finding. So here you can easily see the MRI scan of the brain. So we can see here there are high intensity signals or hyperdense lesions here, indicating that the thalamus and the basal ganglia have been largely quote unquote calcified. Just asking, if you had to do in a tissue the study of the exact mineral deposition, what is the investigation of choice if cost is not a factor? How will you know whether this is iron, this is copper, or this is calcium? What is the investigation of choice if cost is not a factor? It's close to spectrophotometry, but tell me the uh, best investigation to identify the mineral. It's not done clinically. It's a very expensive procedure. It's only done in research. Yes, wonderful, Archon. This is mass spectroscopy. So ideally to identify uh, even a speck of a atom or molecule in something, you have to do a mass spectroscopy to find out the exact chemical nature of the substance. Here, of course, we do not do that. So we depend on clinical science, and we can measure the 24-hour urinary copper excretion, which will be increased. Serum ceruloplasmin will be decreased. And if we can do a liver biopsy, then we can also find increased copper content in the dry tissue of the liver. And a very non-invasive and easy test is a slit lamp examination, where we can find out the Kayser-Fleischer ring over the Descemet's membrane of the eye. So this is the KF ring, and this almost confirms your diagnosis. So now you understand that although the patient came with psychotic features, the treatment is not based on schizophrenia. So the patient should be given symptomatic relief for the Parkinsonism features that the patient is experiencing. Because patient was experiencing psychotic features, we cannot give dopaminergic drugs. That will increase the psychotic feature. So we prefer anticholinergic drug here, like benzhexol or benztropine. And to chelate the copper, we can use penicillamine, and we can reduce the absorption of copper by using zinc. So this is how radiological investigations, coupled with clinical history and a proper biochemical evaluation, gives you the clinical interpretation of a case. So is this clear to everyone? Is the pattern of use of radiology clear to you? So unless you are a radiologist, the use of radiology will be supportive, and you have to learn to use it judiciously. So this is what was the purpose of this workshop, I believe, not to teach radiology in 3 classes, but to develop an aptitude of how to use radiology, how to select the appropriate test, and how to analyze the test in conjunction with the history, clinical finding, and biochemical report to arrive at a clinical diagnosis. So that was today's session. I hope you enjoyed. So Garima, it's over to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir. I think that was a wonderful, beautiful way of explaining radiology in these 3 days. And I'm sure most of us have all our doubts cleared, and it'll help us in our clinical diagnosis while during our clinics as well. If any of you have any doubts, always the WhatsApp group is open, so you can send in your questions there. We'll redirect them to sir, and we'll get back with the answers as soon as possible. And any suggestions or any feedbacks that you have regarding our masterclasses, mostly welcome. And if you've missed any of the beautiful sessions again by Dr. Tirthankar Gaur Thakurta, the previous masterclasses, that was ECG and neurology, the recorded videos are already up on our YouTube channel, so you can always go back and see them. And today's video will also be up soon, so stay connected. Thank you for staying connected throughout these 3 days. I hope you all have enjoyed this masterclass. Stay connected for further information regarding the new masterclasses that we'll be bringing up soon. That'll be all for the workshop. I have some piece of information to share regarding Doctors for a Cause with you all. So I'll just share something with you all. So Doctors for a Cause was having a month-long mental health month in the month of May. We observed this month as for the ones suffering from mental health. We were requesting entries in various art forms, whichever was possible for people. Based on these entries, we had a competition. So we have a mentor and judge, Dr. Shukanto Sarkar, who's a professor in psychiatry at Mahatma Gandhi Medical College and Research Institute in Pondicherry. He's a mentor and judge for the Mental Health Month. He has chosen the winners and he has a beautiful thought process regarding the entire thing. His thoughts are already up on our social, so you can always go and see them. And stay tuned, as we're going to announce some winners of this mental health month in some time soon, within an hour, on our Facebook and Instagram page. So all the best to all the entries, and stay connected for the winners. We'll be up soon. Thank you again to everyone for all the appreciation. We hope to come back soon with another series of the masterclass. Until then, stay safe. Signing off. Garima Dugar, Team Doctors for a Cause.